The chandeliers at Gibson's Prime Steakhouse cast golden light across Chicago's most exclusive dining room. Marcus Blake adjusted his Armani cufflinks and smiled at the woman across from him. Amber Stevens was everything he wanted in a girlfriend. 24, Instagram famous, and impressed by his success. Her phone was already out, capturing their celebration dinner for her 2 million followers. $50 million, baby, Marcus said, raising his champagne glass. My startup just closed the biggest Series B in Chicago tech history. Amber squealed, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she filmed herself. My boyfriend is literally the smartest man alive. TechFlow is going to revolutionize everything. Marcus basked in her admiration. This was his moment of triumph. 6 months ago, he had finalized his divorce from Sarah. 6 months of freedom from her constant questioning, her moral superiority, her inability to understand true ambition. Now he had Amber, who celebrated his wins instead of analyzing his methods. This calls for the Dom Perignon 1996, Marcus told their server, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. He loved an audience for his success. The restaurant hummed with the conversations of Chicago's elite. Lawyers, politicians, and business titans filled every table. This was Marcus's world now, and he belonged here. Sarah had never understood places like this. She preferred hole-in-the-wall diners where she could interview witnesses for her cases. Had preferred, Marcus corrected himself. Sarah's prosecuting days were long over. Oh my God, Amber gasped, her phone still recording. Marcus, look, isn't that your ex-wife? Marcus turned, following Amber's gaze to a corner table by the windows. His blood turned to ice water. There, silhouetted against the Chicago skyline, sat Sarah Collins. She wore a simple navy dress that somehow made every other woman in the room look overdressed. Her dark hair was swept up elegantly, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. She wasn't alone. A distinguished man with silver-touched hair sat across from her, leaning forward intently as she spoke. Even from across the room, Marcus could see the man's complete focus on Sarah, the way he listened as if her words were precious. That's definitely her, Amber whispered, zooming in with her phone camera. She looks different than in your photos, more confident. Marcus felt a familiar surge of irritation. Sarah had no right to look confident, not after everything that had happened, not after he had systematically dismantled her perfect little prosecutor life, piece by piece during their divorce. She should be hiding in shame, not dining at Gibson's like she belonged here. The man across from Sarah reached into his jacket pocket. Marcus watched in disbelief as the stranger stood up and moved around the table. Other diners began to notice, conversations quieting as the man positioned himself beside Sarah's chair. No way, Amber breathed, her phone capturing everything. He's not going to, but he was. The silver-haired man dropped to one knee beside Sarah's chair, producing a small velvet box that seemed to glow under the restaurant's lights. The entire dining room fell silent, all eyes drawn to the unfolding proposal. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The man spoke quietly, his words too low to hear, but his expression conveyed everything: love, respect, and absolute sincerity. This wasn't performative romance. This was real. Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him. His ex-wife, the woman he had destroyed, was being proposed to by someone who clearly adored her. In his restaurant, during his celebration. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face as she said yes. The stranger slipped a ring onto her finger that caught the light and exploded into brilliance. The dining room erupted in spontaneous applause, strangers celebrating a love story they had just witnessed. Holy shit, Amber whispered, still filming. Do you know who that is? That's James Wellington, the venture capitalist. He's worth like $8 billion. $8 billion. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. His $50 million deal suddenly felt like pocket change. His ex-wife was marrying one of the wealthiest men in America. As the couple embraced, James Wellington's face came into clear view. Marcus recognized him now from Forbes covers and tech conferences. Wellington Capital had funded half the major startups in Silicon Valley. The man was a legend, a kingmaker who could destroy careers with a phone call, and he had just proposed to Sarah. The newly engaged couple moved through the restaurant, accepting congratulations from other diners. Sarah's face was radiant with joy, the kind of pure happiness Marcus had never seen from her during their marriage. As they passed his table, Sarah's eyes met his for just a moment. There was no anger in her gaze, no pain, just a brief acknowledgement, as if he were a stranger from her distant past. Then she was gone, swept away by her billionaire fiancé toward the exit. Marcus sat frozen, his celebration dinner turning to ash in his mouth. The power dynamics he had spent years establishing, the careful narrative he had constructed about his superior life choices, had just been obliterated in minutes. He wasn't the winner in this story. He never had been. 3 years earlier, Sarah Collins had been Chicago's most promising federal prosecutor. Her conviction rate was legendary, her courtroom presence intimidating even to seasoned defense attorneys. She specialized in white-collar crime, taking down corrupt executives and financial fraudsters with surgical precision. That was before she met Marcus Blake. Their first encounter happened at a legal tech conference where Marcus was pitching his early-stage startup to potential clients. Sarah was there representing the U.S. Attorney's Office, learning about new digital investigation tools. Marcus spotted her immediately. Brilliant, beautiful, and completely focused on justice rather than profit. The chase lasted 6 months. Marcus deployed every weapon in his considerable charm arsenal. He sent flowers to her office, arranged surprise dinners at romantic restaurants, and most effectively, positioned himself as someone who shared her values. He talked about using technology to make the world better, about building companies with purpose beyond profit. Sarah was cautious at first. Her career was everything to her, and she had seen too many promising women sidelined by the wrong relationships. But Marcus seemed different. He celebrated her victories in court, listened to her talk about complex legal theories, and never once suggested she should want anything beyond her career. The marriage proposal came after a year of dating. Marcus arranged it at the Art Institute of Chicago in front of Sarah's favorite painting. He spoke about building a life together where they could both pursue their passions, where her work fighting corruption would complement his mission to create ethical technology. Sarah said yes because she believed in the vision Marcus painted. She believed in him. The first 2 years of marriage were good. Marcus's startup gained traction while Sarah continued climbing the prosecutor ranks. They hosted dinner parties where tech entrepreneurs mingled with federal attorneys. Sarah thought they were building something meaningful together. The cracks started small. Marcus would make subtle comments about Sarah's work schedule, jokes about how she cared more about criminals than her husband. When she won a major case against a pharmaceutical company, Marcus's congratulations felt hollow. He was more interested in discussing how the verdict might affect his biotech investments. "You realize your crusade against big pharma could hurt innovative companies too," he said over dinner one night. "Not everyone in business is a villain, Sarah." Sarah tried to explain the nuances of her case, but Marcus had already moved on to discussing his next funding round. It was the first time she felt unheard in her own marriage. The pattern accelerated. Marcus began scheduling important business dinners on nights when Sarah had court victories to celebrate. He invited tech executives to their home, but never introduced Sarah as a federal prosecutor, just as "my wife." When Sarah tried to join conversations about business ethics, Marcus would deflect with jokes about lawyers ruining innovation. The subtle isolation was masterful. Marcus never forbade Sarah from seeing friends, but he scheduled couple obligations whenever she had plans with colleagues. He never directly criticized her career, but he praised other wives who had work-life balance. He never called her work meaningless, but he consistently treated it as less important than his business dealings. Sarah began doubting herself. Maybe she was too focused on work. Maybe she was being naive about how business really operated. Maybe Marcus understood the world better than she did. The final blow came during Sarah's biggest case. She was prosecuting TechCorp's CEO for securities fraud, a case that had taken 2 years to build. The night before closing arguments, Marcus came home with devastating news. "I need to tell you something," he said, his face grave. "TechCorp is one of our biggest potential clients. If they go down, it could destroy my company. 300 jobs, Sarah. Real people with families." Sarah stared at her husband. "You're asking me to lose this case on purpose?" "I'm asking you to consider the bigger picture. Sometimes justice isn't black and white. Sarah realized that Marcus had known about the Tech Corp connection from the beginning. He had watched her build the case for months without saying a word. Now, at the crucial moment, he was asking her to choose between her integrity and his profit. She won the case. Tech Corp's CEO got 15 years in federal prison. Marcus's company survived, but their marriage didn't. The divorce proceedings revealed the true Marcus Blake. He hired a team of ruthless attorneys who painted Sarah as an obsessive workaholic who prioritized her career over family. They leaked stories to legal blogs about her vendetta against businesses. They questioned her mental stability, pointing to her dedication to cases as evidence of unhealthy obsession. Marcus testified that Sarah had become increasingly hostile to the business community and paranoid about corporate influence. He suggested she had lost perspective, that her prosecutorial instincts had poisoned their personal relationship. The media coverage was devastating. Legal blogs questioned whether Sarah's convictions were fair or part of an anti-business agenda. Colleagues began avoiding her. Her superiors started scrutinizing her cases more closely. Sarah's reputation crumbled. Without tenure protection, she became a liability to the U.S. Attorney's Office. They offered her a quiet resignation rather than face continued controversy. At 31, Sarah Collins found herself unemployed, divorced, and radioactive in the legal community. Marcus walked away with their shared assets and a narrative that painted him as the victim of an unstable ex-wife. But Sarah had one thing Marcus couldn't destroy. Her mother, Diane Collins, a retired nurse who had raised Sarah as a single parent. Diane's small house in Lincoln Park became Sarah's refuge as she tried to rebuild her shattered life. "You're stronger than this," Diane told her daughter one night as they sorted through boxes of Sarah's belongings. "That man didn't break you. He just revealed what he really was." Sarah wanted to believe her mother, but some days the damage felt permanent. The woman who had fearlessly taken on corporate giants now struggled to order coffee without second-guessing herself. Marcus's psychological warfare had been devastatingly effective. It would take 2 years for Sarah to find her voice again. 2 years of therapy, of slowly rebuilding her confidence, of learning to trust her own judgment once more. She started a small consulting practice, helping other attorneys with white-collar cases. The work was meaningful but modest. Sarah thought she had found peace with her smaller life. She was wrong. Marcus Blake wasn't finished with her yet. 2 years after the divorce, Sarah had carved out a quiet existence in Chicago's legal community. Her consulting practice operated from a small office in River North, helping overwhelmed public defenders and small firms navigate complex financial crimes. The work paid enough to cover her mother's increasing medical bills and keep a modest apartment near Lincoln Park. The trauma of her marriage and career destruction had left invisible scars. Sarah found herself triple-checking every decision, seeking validation for choices she once made instinctively. The confident federal prosecutor who had faced down corporate titans now hesitated before ordering lunch. Marcus's systematic undermining had rewired her neural pathways, making self-doubt her default setting. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Sarah's therapist, helped her understand the mechanics of psychological abuse. "Gaslighting works by making you question your own reality," Dr. Vasquez explained during one of their weekly sessions. "Marcus didn't just attack your reputation. He attacked your ability to trust yourself." The healing process was frustratingly slow. Some days Sarah felt like her old self, sharp and decisive. Other days she couldn't shake the voice in her head that sounded exactly like Marcus, questioning every choice, every instinct. But she was building something new. Her consulting clients began recommending her to others. She developed expertise in financial technology crimes, helping prosecutors understand blockchain fraud and cryptocurrency money laundering. Her reputation for thorough, honest work gradually spread through Chicago's legal community. The breakthrough came when she helped convict a crypto pyramid scheme that had defrauded elderly investors. The case garnered positive media attention, and for the first time in years, Sarah's name appeared in news articles as an expert rather than a cautionary tale. That success led to an invitation to speak at a legal technology conference downtown. Sarah almost declined, remembering the last time she had attended such an event, when she met Marcus. But Dr. Vasquez encouraged her to face the fear. "You belong in these spaces," the therapist said, Don't let him take that from you forever. The conference was held at the Palmer House Hotel, the same venue where Sarah had once testified before a grand jury about financial crimes. Walking into the ornate lobby triggered a flood of memories from her prosecutor days. For a moment, she felt like an imposter wearing a borrowed confidence. Her presentation focused on identifying financial crimes in emerging technologies. As she spoke about patterns of fraud and regulatory gaps, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the thrill of being the smartest person in the room. Not arrogant intelligence, but the deep satisfaction of expertise earned through hard work and bitter experience. After her talk, several attendees approached with questions and business cards. One man waited until the crowd dispersed before introducing himself. "Ms. Collins, I'm James Wellington. That was a remarkable presentation." Sarah recognized the name immediately. Wellington Capital was legendary in venture capital circles, known for backing ethical technology companies and maintaining rigorous due diligence standards. James Wellington himself was often quoted in financial media about responsible investing. He was taller than she expected, with silver threading through dark hair and intelligent gray eyes that held her attention without making her uncomfortable. He wore an expensive suit but seemed more interested in her insights than in displaying his own importance. "Thank you," Sarah said, accepting his business card. "I'm familiar with your work. Wellington Capital has an impressive portfolio." "We try to invest in companies that make the world better," James replied, "which is why I'd like to discuss something with you. We're seeing an increase in financial crimes targeting our portfolio companies, sophisticated fraud schemes that exploit new technologies. I think you could help us protect our investments and their customers." The conversation continued over coffee in the hotel lobby. James asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's methodology, her experience with different types of financial crimes, and her perspective on regulatory enforcement. He never made her feel like she was being interviewed or tested. Instead, it felt like a collaboration between equals. "Most consultants tell me what they think I want to hear," James said as their second hour of conversation began. "You're telling me what I need to know. That's rare." Sarah felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced since before Marcus: professional pride mixed with personal attraction. James Wellington was brilliant, successful, and seemingly interested in her mind rather than her appearance. But the voice of doubt, Marcus's legacy, whispered warnings about powerful men with hidden agendas. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah said carefully, "but I should mention that my reputation in the legal community is complicated. There was some controversy around my divorce that might concern your investors." James's expression didn't change. "I'm not interested in gossip or character assassination campaigns. I'm interested in your track record of successful prosecutions and your expertise in financial crimes. Everything else is irrelevant." The consulting arrangement began with a single case: investigating suspicious trading patterns around one of Wellington Capital's fintech investments. Sarah discovered a complex insider trading scheme involving the company's CFO and several hedge fund managers. Her work led to multiple SEC investigations and criminal charges. James was impressed not just by Sarah's findings, but by her methodology. She built airtight cases with meticulous documentation, assuming that every conclusion would be challenged by skilled defense attorneys. Her prosecutor training served her well in the private sector. More importantly, James treated Sarah's work with respect. He implemented her recommendations without modification, included her in strategic discussions, and credited her expertise in meetings with other investors. After years of having her intelligence dismissed or questioned, Sarah found herself working with someone who valued her contributions. The professional relationship evolved slowly into something personal. James invited Sarah to industry dinners where she met other venture capitalists and technology executives. Unlike Marcus's networking events, where Sarah had felt like decorative arm candy, these gatherings welcomed her as an expert in her own right. James never pushed for more than Sarah was ready to give. When she mentioned her therapy appointments, he didn't probe for details but simply adjusted meeting schedules to accommodate her needs. When she had bad days triggered by memories of her marriage, he gave her space without taking it personally. "You don't have to explain your healing process to me," he said one afternoon when Sarah apologized for seeming distant. "Trauma affects everyone differently. I'm here when you're ready, whatever that looks like." The patience and respect were intoxicating after years of Marcus's demands and manipulations. Sarah began to remember what healthy partnership could feel like. But she was also terrified of making the same mistakes that had nearly destroyed her the first time. 6 months into their working relationship, Sarah's mother began showing signs of memory problems. Diane would forget conversations they had just finished or struggle to remember familiar neighbors' names. Sarah arranged medical consultations while trying to hide her growing panic. The diagnosis was early-stage Alzheimer's disease, progressive and incurable, but manageable with proper care and medication. Sarah felt her carefully rebuilt world threatening to collapse again. James's response surprised her. Instead of retreating from the complication, he researched the best specialists in Chicago and connected Sarah with support groups for adult children of Alzheimer's patients. He never treated Diane's condition as Sarah's burden to bear alone. Family obligations aren't obstacles to work around, he told Sarah when she worried about missing meetings for medical appointments. They're life. Real life is messy and unpredictable. Anyone who doesn't understand that isn't worth working with. For the first time since her divorce, Sarah began to hope that she might have found someone who saw her as a complete person rather than a collection of useful skills. But the voice of doubt, Marcus's lasting gift, continued whispering warnings about trusting powerful men. She had no idea that Marcus Blake was about to make those whispers sound like screams. Marcus Blake's initial reaction to seeing Sarah with James Wellington was pure rage. His celebration dinner with Amber turned into a silent funeral as he processed the implications of what he had witnessed. Sarah wasn't just surviving without him. She was thriving with someone infinitely more successful than Marcus would ever be. The drive home to his Lincoln Park penthouse was torture. Amber chattered excitedly about the proposal she had filmed, already planning how to monetize the viral moment for her social media channels. Marcus barely heard her. His mind was consumed with calculating the power differential between himself and James Wellington. 50 million in startup funding versus 8 billion in net worth. A tech entrepreneur versus a venture capital legend. A man climbing the ladder versus someone who owned the entire building. "Baby, you're being weird," Amber said as they entered Marcus's apartment. "Aren't you happy for your ex-wife? She looked really in love." "She looks smug," Marcus snapped, pouring himself a large bourbon. "Sarah always thought she was better than everyone else. Now she's found someone to validate that delusion." Amber frowned, studying Marcus's face in the dim lighting. "I thought you said she was boring and couldn't keep up with you. If she's so beneath you, why does this bother you so much?" The question hit too close to home. Marcus had spent 2 years telling himself that divorcing Sarah was a strategic upgrade. Amber was younger, more beautiful, more impressed by his success. She was supposed to be proof that he had made the right choice. But seeing Sarah's genuine joy tonight, the way James Wellington looked at her with unmistakable adoration, Marcus realized that his narrative had been a lie. He hadn't upgraded. He had thrown away something precious and convinced himself it was worthless. "It doesn't bother me," Marcus lied. "I'm just surprised someone fell for her act. Sarah's very good at playing the victim." Over the following days, Marcus became obsessed with learning everything about James Wellington and his relationship with Sarah. He hired a private investigator, ostensibly to conduct due diligence on a potential business partner. In reality, he was looking for ammunition. The investigator's report was frustratingly clean. James Wellington had built his fortune through legitimate investments and had never been involved in any scandals. His first wife had died of cancer 5 years earlier, and he had no children. His reputation in the venture capital world was impeccable. More infuriating was what the investigator discovered about Sarah's new life. She had built a successful consulting practice specializing in financial technology crimes. She was respected in her field and had been featured in several legal publications as an expert on emerging fraud schemes. The Sarah that Marcus remembered was broken, defeated, questioning her own judgment. This new version seemed confident and professionally accomplished. The investigator's photos showed her speaking at conferences, meeting with high-profile clients, and looking genuinely happy. Marcus realized that his careful destruction of Sarah's career and self-esteem had been temporary. She had healed, rebuilt, and found success without him. The knowledge was intolerable. The opportunity for revenge came through an unexpected source: Sarah's mother. Marcus remembered Diane Collins as a sharp, protective woman who had never liked him. She had seen through his charm from the beginning and had probably influenced Sarah's decision to pursue the divorce so aggressively. During their marriage, Sarah had mentioned her mother's occasional forgetfulness. At the time, Marcus had dismissed it as normal aging. But the investigator's report revealed a more serious situation. Diane Collins had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease and was increasingly dependent on Sarah for care. The diagnosis gave Marcus the leverage he needed. He arranged for a different investigator, one with fewer ethical constraints, to gather information about Diane's condition and care arrangements. What he discovered was a vulnerability that could destroy Sarah's newfound happiness. Sarah was handling her mother's care personally rather than using professional services. She attended medical appointments, managed medications, and spent evenings at her mother's house ensuring she was safe. The arrangement was emotionally and financially draining, but Sarah was committed to providing the best possible care. More importantly, Sarah hadn't told James Wellington the full extent of her mother's condition. She had mentioned memory problems, but not the Alzheimer's diagnosis or the progressive nature of the disease. Marcus suspected that Sarah was afraid of being seen as damaged goods, carrying too much emotional baggage for a billionaire's lifestyle. Marcus crafted his attack carefully. He couldn't approach Sarah directly without raising suspicions. Instead, he would use intermediaries and create a crisis that forced her to choose between protecting her mother and maintaining her relationship with James. The first step was anonymous tips to Adult Protective Services, suggesting that Diane Collins was being neglected by her daughter. Marcus provided just enough accurate information about Diane's condition to trigger an investigation, while implying that Sarah was either incompetent or deliberately neglectful. The APS investigation was routine and quickly concluded that Diane was receiving appropriate care, but the process was traumatic for both women. Social workers interviewed neighbors, reviewed medical records, and evaluated the home environment. Diane became confused and frightened by the strangers asking questions about her daughter. Sarah was devastated by the implication that she was failing her mother. The investigation triggered all her insecurities about her judgment and competence that Marcus had planted during their marriage. Even though the case was closed with no findings of neglect, Sarah began second-guessing every care decision. The second phase was more sophisticated. Marcus used shell companies to hire professionals who began documenting Diane's public behavior. They photographed her looking confused in grocery stores, recorded her getting lost in familiar neighborhoods, and gathered evidence of her declining cognitive function. None of this was illegal or even unethical in isolation. Diane's condition was progressing naturally, and her symptoms were becoming more visible to casual observers. But Marcus was building a narrative that Sarah was either hiding her mother's severe mental illness from James or exploiting it for sympathy and financial support. The final piece was approaching James Wellington directly. Marcus arranged a seemingly chance encounter at a venture capital networking event, introducing himself as a fellow Chicago entrepreneur. He didn't mention his connection to Sarah initially, instead positioning himself as someone seeking investment advice. "I've heard great things about your due diligence process," Marcus told James over drinks at the Union Club. "Very thorough. I imagine you investigate every aspect of potential partners and consultants." James was polite but distant. He had little interest in Marcus's startup and even less in his attempts at networking. But Marcus persisted, gradually steering the conversation toward the importance of transparency in business relationships. "The worst partnerships I've seen failed because someone wasn't honest about their situation," Marcus said. "Hidden debts, family problems, health issues, things that seem personal but end up affecting business judgment." It was a perfectly reasonable observation that any experienced investor would agree with. But Marcus was planting seeds of doubt about Sarah's honesty and reliability. He never mentioned her name, but he knew that James would begin questioning what he didn't know about his new consultant and romantic interest. The psychological manipulation was subtle but effective. Marcus had learned during his marriage to Sarah that the most devastating attacks weren't direct confrontations, but slow erosions of confidence and trust. He was applying the same methodology to destroy her relationship with James Wellington, but Marcus underestimated both Sarah's resilience and James's integrity. The seeds of doubt he planted would eventually grow, but not in the direction he expected. Instead of driving James away from Sarah, Marcus's campaign would ultimately expose his own character to someone with the power to destroy him completely. The war for Sarah's future was just beginning, and Marcus Blake had chosen the wrong enemy. Sarah's relationship with James deepened through the winter months as they worked together on increasingly complex cases. What had begun as professional consulting evolved into genuine partnership, both in business and in life. James's respect for her intelligence and his patience with her healing process created a foundation of trust that Sarah had never experienced before. The difference between James and Marcus was stark in every interaction. Where Marcus had demanded constant validation and attention, James was secure enough to celebrate Sarah's independent successes. When she solved a particularly challenging fraud case without his input, James's pride in her accomplishment was genuine and unselfish. "You're wasted on consulting," James told her one evening as they reviewed case files in his Lakeshore Drive penthouse. "You should be teaching at Northwestern's law school or running the SEC's enforcement division." Sarah laughed, but the suggestion stirred something she had thought Marcus had killed forever: professional ambition beyond mere survival. "After what happened with my reputation, no major institution would touch me." "Reputations can be rebuilt," James said firmly, "especially when they were unfairly destroyed in the first place. Your ex-husband was a master manipulator, but his narrative about you won't hold up to sustained scrutiny." The casual way James dismissed Marcus's character assassination campaign was both healing and terrifying for Sarah. She wanted to believe that her past mistakes and public humiliation wouldn't define her forever. But the voice of doubt, Marcus's lasting poison, whispered warnings about trusting in redemption. Their first real test came when James invited Sarah to accompany him to a tech industry gala in San Francisco. The event would include venture capitalists, startup founders, and technology executives from across the country. Sarah would be introduced not as James's consultant, but as his partner, both professionally and personally. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked as they planned the trip. "My name still carries baggage in some circles. I don't want to create problems for your business relationships." James cupped her face gently, his gray eyes serious. "Sarah, you are not a liability. You're an asset. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be in business with me." The San Francisco trip exceeded Sarah's expectations. She found herself in conversations with brilliant entrepreneurs and seasoned investors who valued her insights into financial regulation and fraud prevention. Several venture capital firms expressed interest in retaining her services for their portfolio companies. Most importantly, James never left her side or excluded her from important discussions. At previous industry events with Marcus, Sarah had often found herself relegated to spouse conversations while the real business happened elsewhere. James treated her as an equal partner in every interaction. On their last night in California, James took Sarah to dinner at a small restaurant in Napa Valley. The setting was intimate and romantic, far removed from the networking demands of the conference. As they shared wine and talked about everything except work, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before her marriage: complete peace. "I have something to ask you," James said as dessert arrived. For a moment, Sarah's heart stopped, thinking he was about to propose. Instead, he pulled out a different kind of document. "Wellington Capital is launching a new initiative focused on ethical technology investments," he explained. "We want to fund companies that prioritize social responsibility alongside profit. I'd like you to lead the due diligence process, not as a consultant, but as a partner." The offer was stunning. Partnership in Wellington Capital would make Sarah one of the most powerful women in venture capitalism. She would have equity, decision-making authority, and the resources to reshape how technology companies approached ethical issues. "This isn't charity," James continued. "You're the most qualified person I know for this role. Your legal background, your understanding of fraud patterns, and your moral compass make you irreplaceable." Sarah stared at the partnership documents, afraid to touch them in case they disappeared. "James, this is incredible. But are you sure you want to mix business and personal relationships? What if things don't work out between us?" "Then we'll handle it professionally," James said simply. "But I'm not offering this because we're involved romantically. I'm offering it because you're brilliant and I trust your judgment completely." That night, for the first time since her divorce, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future defined by possibility, rather than limitation. She could rebuild her career at the highest levels, use her expertise to prevent financial crimes on a massive scale, and do it all alongside someone who valued her contributions. The partnership announcement generated significant media attention. Financial publications profiled Sarah as a rising star in venture capital, emphasizing her unique background in federal prosecution and financial crime prevention. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, treating her divorce controversy as ancient history. Sarah's mother was delighted by the news, even as her own condition continued to deteriorate. Diane's good days were becoming rarer, but she remained fiercely proud of her daughter's accomplishments. "You're becoming the woman I always knew you could be," Diane told Sarah during one of their evening visits. "Don't let anyone make you smaller again." The words were prophetic. Unknown to Sarah, Marcus Blake was already planning his most devastating attack yet. Her professional success and personal happiness had made her a target for his narcissistic rage. The anonymous tips to Adult Protective Services had been just the opening move in a much larger campaign. Marcus had spent months building a network of private investigators, unethical journalists, and disgruntled former colleagues who could be motivated to attack Sarah's reputation. He had learned from his divorce strategy, understanding that direct confrontation would only make him look petty. This time, his assault would come from multiple directions simultaneously. The trigger was Sarah's partnership announcement. Seeing her name in the Wall Street Journal as James Wellington's business partner sent Marcus into a fury that consumed every rational thought. The woman he had broken was not only whole again, but more successful than he would ever be. Marcus began implementing his plan the day after the announcement appeared. He would systematically destroy Sarah's credibility, her relationship with James, and her ability to trust herself. By the time he was finished, Sarah would understand that crossing Marcus Blake carried permanent consequences. But Marcus had made a critical error in his assessment of James Wellington. The venture capitalist was not just wealthy and connected. He was also fiercely protective of the people he loved. Marcus was about to discover that attacking Sarah Collins meant declaring war on one of the most powerful men in American business. The battle for Sarah's future was entering its most dangerous phase. And this time, the stakes were higher than just one woman's career. The conflict would expose the true character of everyone involved and determine whether justice could triumph over calculated cruelty. The attack began subtly, as Marcus's most effective strategies always did. 3 weeks after Sarah's partnership announcement, a blog post appeared on FinTech Weekly questioning her qualifications for the venture capital role. The article, written by an anonymous industry insider, suggested that Sarah's legal background might not translate to investment expertise. While Ms. Collins has impressive prosecutorial experience, the post read, venture capital requires a fundamentally different skill set. Investors must assess potential rather than prosecute failures. There's concern that her adversarial legal training could damage relationships with promising entrepreneurs. The criticism was professionally worded and appeared reasonably, making it difficult to dismiss as a personal attack. Sarah initially brushed it off as typical industry skepticism about outsiders entering venture capital. James encouraged her to ignore the noise and focus on building their new initiative. But the blog post was just the beginning. Over the following days, similar articles appeared on other industry websites, each raising questions about Sarah's fitness for her new role. The authors were different, but the talking points were remarkably consistent. Legal training versus business acumen, prosecutorial mindset versus collaborative investment approach, concern about Sarah's ability to work with entrepreneurs. The coordinated nature of the attack became clear when Sarah discovered that several of the critical articles contained identical phrases and statistics. Someone was providing talking points to multiple writers, orchestrating a campaign designed to undermine her credibility before she could establish herself in venture capital. James's response was swift and decisive. Wellington Capital's communications team began reaching out to the publications, demanding retractions for factually inaccurate statements and threatening legal action for defamatory content. Most of the smaller blogs quickly removed their articles rather than face litigation from a billionaire's legal team. "Someone is targeting you specifically," James told Sarah as they reviewed the pattern of attacks. "This isn't random industry criticism. It's organized character assassination." Sarah felt the familiar chill of recognition. The tactics were identical to those Marcus had used during their divorce. Multiple sources repeating similar narratives, professional-sounding criticism designed to plant doubt, attacks on her competence disguised as reasonable concerns. "I think I know who's behind this," Sarah said quietly. "My ex-husband used the same playbook when he destroyed my prosecutor career." James's expression hardened. "Marcus Blake? The tech entrepreneur who was celebrating at Gibson's the night I proposed?" Sarah was surprised that James remembered Marcus from that evening. "You saw him there?" "I noticed him because he was staring at us throughout dinner. I assumed he was just another entrepreneur hoping to network. But when you mentioned he was your ex-husband, I made note of him." The knowledge that Marcus had been watching them that night made Sarah's skin crawl. She realized that his current campaign wasn't opportunistic but calculated revenge for witnessing her happiness. James immediately assigned a team of investigators to document the connections between the critical articles and trace their funding sources. What they discovered was a sophisticated disinformation network centered around shell companies and anonymous payments to freelance writers. The trail led back to TechFlow Dynamics, Marcus's startup. He had used company funds to hire a public relations firm specializing in reputation management, ostensibly to promote his own business, but actually to attack Sarah's credibility. "We have him," James said as they reviewed the evidence. "This is actionable defamation with clear financial damages. My legal team can destroy him in court." But Sarah hesitated. "A lawsuit would create exactly the kind of public controversy that Marcus wants. It would keep the focus on my past rather than my future work. Maybe we should just ignore him until he loses interest." The decision to avoid confrontation was a mistake that would haunt Sarah for months. Marcus interpreted her restraint as weakness and escalated his campaign accordingly. If subtle character assassination wasn't enough to destroy her partnership with James, he would deploy more devastating weapons. The next phase targeted Sarah's most vulnerable point, her mother's deteriorating condition. Marcus had continued monitoring Diane Collins through private investigators, documenting her increasing confusion and unsafe behaviors. He now began using that information as ammunition. Anonymous calls to elder abuse hotlines reported that Diane Collins was being financially exploited by her daughter. The callers provided specific details about Sarah's income from Wellington Capital and suggested that she was using her mother's medical condition to gain sympathy and career advancement from wealthy benefactors. The allegations were absurd to anyone who knew Sarah, but they triggered mandatory investigations by adult protective services and financial institutions. Sarah found herself defending her mother's care decisions to skeptical social workers and explaining her consulting fees to bank investigators. The process was exhausting and humiliating. Sarah had to provide financial records, proving that she was supporting her mother rather than exploiting her. She had to undergo psychological evaluations to demonstrate her fitness as a caregiver. Most painfully, she had to watch her mother become frightened and confused by the repeated interviews and home visits. "Why are these people asking about you?" Diane asked during one of her clearer moments. "You're a good daughter. You take care of me." Sarah couldn't explain that someone was trying to destroy their family out of spite. Her mother's condition was too fragile to handle that level of cruelty. Instead, Sarah absorbed the emotional toll alone, spending her days managing investigations and her nights caring for Diane. The stress began affecting Sarah's work performance. She was distracted during meetings, exhausted from sleepless nights, and constantly anxious about the next attack. James noticed the change but attributed it to the adjustment of starting a new career, rather than ongoing harassment. Marcus's most brilliant stroke was making Sarah complicit in hiding the crisis from James. She was too proud to admit that she couldn't handle the pressure and too protective of their relationship to burden him with her problems. The isolation was exactly what Marcus intended, Sarah alone against a sustained assault on her stability. The breaking point came when Marcus escalated to direct threats against Diane's safety. Sarah received anonymous messages suggesting that her mother's medications could be easily tampered with or that elderly people with dementia were vulnerable to accidents in their own homes. The threats were never explicit enough to constitute criminal behavior, but their meaning was clear. Marcus could hurt Diane Collins whenever he chose. Sarah's mother was being held hostage to ensure her daughter's compliance with Marcus's demands. At that moment, sitting in her mother's kitchen while Diane slept peacefully upstairs, Sarah realized that Marcus Blake would never stop. He wasn't trying to win her back or protect his reputation. He was trying to systematically destroy every aspect of her life until she had nothing left. The woman who had once fearlessly prosecuted corporate criminals was being terrorized by her ex-husband, and she was too ashamed to ask for help. Marcus had succeeded in isolating her from her strongest ally precisely when she needed support most. But Sarah had underestimated James Wellington's protective instincts and investigative resources. While she struggled alone against Marcus's attacks, James was conducting his own inquiry into the pattern of harassment targeting his partner. What he discovered would change everything and put Marcus Blake in the crosshairs of one of America's most powerful men. The predator was about to become prey, but not before inflicting maximum damage on his intended victim. The worst was yet to come. Sarah's decision to meet Marcus alone was born of desperation rather than courage. After weeks of escalating harassment, anonymous threats against her mother, and the constant stress of hiding the crisis from James, she felt cornered with no viable options. When Marcus sent a message suggesting they could resolve their issues through direct conversation, Sarah agreed despite every instinct screaming warnings. The meeting location was neutral territory, a coffee shop in Lincoln Park near Sarah's old neighborhood. Marcus arrived first, positioning himself at a corner table with clear sight lines to all entrances. He looked successful and confident, wearing an expensive suit that broadcast his startup's recent funding success. Sarah entered the cafe feeling exhausted and defeated. The weeks of sustained attacks had taken their toll, leaving her emotionally drained and physically depleted. She recognized the tactical disadvantage immediately. Marcus was energized by conflict while she was worn down by it. "Sarah," Marcus said warmly as she approached his table, "you look tired. This whole venture capital thing must be more stressful than you expected." Atrinahan. The false concern in his voice was infuriating, but Sarah forced herself to remain calm. "What do you want, Marcus? Your message said you wanted to resolve our issues." Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting to mock sincerity. "I want to help you avoid making a terrible mistake. James Wellington is using you, Sarah. He's a venture capitalist who sees opportunity in your legal background, but he doesn't actually care about you as a person." The accusation was so absurd that Sarah almost laughed. "You don't know anything about James or our relationship." "I know more than you think," Marcus replied, producing his phone. "I've been tracking his business activities since you started working together. Did you know that Wellington Capital has been quietly acquiring competitors' portfolio companies? Your legal expertise is being used to identify vulnerable targets for hostile takeovers." Tronikun. Marcus showed Sarah a series of documents and financial reports that appeared to support his claims. The information looked legitimate, complete with SEC filings and internal memos from Wellington Capital. According to Marcus's evidence, James was using Sarah's fraud investigations to identify companies with hidden vulnerabilities that could be exploited for aggressive acquisitions. "He's not your partner," Marcus continued. "He's your handler. You're doing the investigation work that allows him to destroy smaller competitors while maintaining plausible deniability about his methods." Sarah stared at the documents, her mind racing. The papers looked authentic, and the financial transactions were consistent with venture capital operations. But something felt wrong about Marcus's presentation, too convenient and perfectly timed to undermine her confidence in James. "Even if this were true," Sarah said carefully, "why would you care? You made it clear during our divorce that you thought I was naive about business ethics." Marcus's mask slipped slightly, revealing the anger beneath his false concern. "Because I don't want to see you get used again. You were always too trusting, too willing to believe the best about people. Wellington is going to destroy your reputation, just like I did, except this time it will be for profit rather than principle." The admission was revealing. Marcus was confessing to deliberately destroying Sarah's prosecutor career while claiming to protect her from similar treatment by James. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. "You're lying," Sarah said, standing to leave. "About James, about his business practices, about caring what happens to me. This is just another way to control my life." Marcus grabbed her wrist as she turned away, his grip firm enough to prevent her from leaving without causing a scene. "Sit down, Sarah. We're not finished." The physical contact triggered memories of their marriage. moments when Marcus's charm had given way to intimidation. Sarah felt the familiar spike of fear, followed immediately by rage at her own vulnerability. "Let go of me," she said quietly, her prosecutor voice cutting through the cafe's ambient noise. Marcus released her wrist but didn't retreat. "I have recordings, Sarah. Conversations between you and Wellington discussing specific companies and their vulnerabilities. Audio that proves you've been gathering intelligence for hostile takeovers while pretending to conduct fraud investigations." Sarah's blood turned cold. "That's impossible. I've never discussed anything like that with James." "Haven't you?" Marcus smiled coldly. "Every briefing about a company's financial weaknesses, every assessment of their legal vulnerabilities, every recommendation about their acquisition potential. It's all been recorded and edited to show your complicity in Wellington's predatory practices." The threat was clear. Marcus had been surveillance their conversations and could manipulate the recordings to create false evidence of Sarah's involvement in unethical business practices. Even if the accusations were eventually disproven, the initial damage to her reputation would be irreversible. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "I want you to end your partnership with Wellington Capital," Marcus said. "Publicly distance yourself from James and return to small-scale consulting work. Stop pretending to be something you're not." The demand was designed to destroy everything Sarah had rebuilt. Her partnership with James represented not just professional success, but personal healing and hope for the future. Marcus was asking her to voluntarily surrender the life she had fought to create. "And if I refuse?" Marcus's smile widened. "Then the recordings get released to every major business publication simultaneously. Your career in venture capital ends before it begins. Wellington Capital faces regulatory investigation, and James learns exactly how much damage your participation can do to his reputation." The threat was devastating in its completeness. Marcus had engineered a scenario where fighting back would hurt James more than surrender would hurt Sarah. He was using her love for James as a weapon against both of them. "I need time to consider," Sarah said, hoping to create space for developing a counter-strategy. "You have 24 hours, Marcus replied. "After that, the recordings go public regardless of your decision. I'm done watching you pretend to be successful while riding someone else's coattails." Sarah left the coffee shop feeling more defeated than at any point since her divorce. Marcus had played the game perfectly, isolating her from support networks and creating a scenario where every possible response resulted in devastating consequences. That evening, sitting in her mother's kitchen while Diane slept upstairs, Sarah considered her options. She could confess everything to James and hope that his resources could counter Marcus's attack. But the recordings, even if fabricated, would create enough doubt to damage his business relationships. She could fight publicly and risk destroying the man she loved along with herself. Or she could surrender and accept permanent exile from the life she wanted. The decision was ultimately made for her when Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It contained a single link to a private audio file hosted on a secure server. The recording was a conversation between Sarah and James discussing the financial vulnerabilities of a biotech startup they were considering for investment. The conversation was real, but Marcus had edited it to remove context and splice in additional statements that made Sarah sound like she was gathering intelligence for a predatory acquisition. Her voice discussing legitimate due diligence had been manipulated to suggest conspiracy and fraud. The technical sophistication was remarkable. Anyone listening to the recording without prior knowledge would conclude that Sarah was helping James identify vulnerable companies for hostile takeovers. The evidence would be compelling enough to trigger regulatory investigations and destroy both their reputations. Sarah realized that Marcus had been planning this attack for months, possibly since the night he witnessed James's proposal. The surveillance, the harassment of her mother, the character assassination campaign, everything had been building toward this moment of total checkmate. She was trapped with no good options and 24 hours to choose how completely she would be destroyed. The prosecutor, who had once fearlessly taken on corporate giants, was being blackmailed by her ex-husband into abandoning everything she had rebuilt. But Sarah had forgotten one crucial factor in her despair. James Wellington hadn't built his fortune by being naive about predators. While she struggled alone against Marcus's assault, James had been conducting his own investigation into the man threatening his partner. What he had discovered would shift the balance of power permanently and expose Marcus Blake to consequences he had never imagined. The hunter was about to become the hunted, but not before inflicting maximum psychological damage on his intended victim. The final confrontation was approaching, and only one side knew that the rules of engagement were about to change completely. James Wellington had been conducting his own investigation into Marcus Blake for weeks, using resources that made Sarah's ex-husband's private detectives look like amateur hour. Wellington Capital's security team included former FBI agents, corporate intelligence specialists, and cybersecurity experts who could trace digital fingerprints across multiple jurisdictions. What they discovered was far more extensive than Sarah's harassment campaign. Marcus Blake was a serial predator who used identical tactics against multiple targets, including business rivals, former employees, and ex-girlfriends. His methods were sophisticated but followed predictable patterns: surveillance, character assassination, and psychological manipulation designed to isolate victims from support networks. The investigation revealed that TechFlow Dynamics, Marcus's startup, was largely fraudulent. The $50 million funding round that Marcus had celebrated at Gibson's Steakhouse was based on fabricated financial projections and stolen intellectual property from competitors. Several of the company's key patents had been obtained through industrial espionage conducted by the same private investigators Marcus used for personal vendettas. More damning was evidence that Marcus had been embezzling from his own company to fund his harassment campaigns. Corporate funds intended for product development were being diverted to pay for surveillance operations, manufactured controversies, and sophisticated disinformation campaigns. The pattern represented multiple federal crimes, including wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate embezzlement. James's team had been gathering this evidence systematically while Sarah struggled alone against Marcus's escalating attacks. The venture capitalist understood that direct confrontation would only trigger more aggressive retaliation against Sarah. Instead, he was building an airtight case that would neutralize Marcus permanently while protecting the woman he loved. The breakthrough came when James's cybersecurity team identified the source of the fabricated audio recordings. Marcus had been using cutting-edge deepfake technology to manipulate conversations between Sarah and James, but the software left distinctive digital signatures that could be forensically identified. The deepfake revelation was devastating for Marcus's credibility. Not only were his recordings fabricated, but the technology required to create them was prohibitively expensive and technically sophisticated. Marcus had purchased the software using TechFlow corporate funds, creating additional evidence of embezzlement and fraud. James moved decisively once he had overwhelming evidence of Marcus's criminal activities. Rather than confronting him directly, James orchestrated a carefully planned exposure that would destroy Marcus's reputation and business simultaneously while protecting Sarah from retaliation. The first step was alerting TechFlow's investors about the embezzlement and fraud. James provided detailed financial analysis showing how corporate funds had been diverted for personal use, along with evidence that the company's key intellectual property had been stolen from competitors. The investor response was swift and merciless. Marcus was removed as CEO within 24 hours and faced immediate lawsuits for breach of fiduciary duty. Simultaneously, James's team released information about Marcus's harassment campaigns to law enforcement agencies. The FBI's white-collar crime division was particularly interested in the systematic pattern of fraud and the interstate nature of Marcus's operations. Federal prosecutors began preparing criminal charges that could result in decades of prison time. The public exposure was methodical and overwhelming. Business publications received detailed documentation of TechFlow's fraudulent practices, complete with forensic accounting and digital evidence. Technology blogs were provided with proof that Marcus had stolen intellectual property from smaller competitors while claiming to be an innovative entrepreneur. Most devastatingly, Marcus's history of harassment and manipulation was exposed through testimonials from multiple victims. Sarah wasn't alone. Marcus had used identical tactics against former employees who had challenged his authority, business rivals who had competed with his startups, and ex-girlfriends who had tried to leave him. The pattern evidence was damning because it showed deliberate, repeated criminal behavior rather than isolated incidents. Marcus Blake wasn't just Sarah's abusive ex-husband. He was a serial predator who had built his entire career on fraud, theft, and intimidation. The collapse of Marcus's empire happened with stunning speed. Techflow Dynamics declared bankruptcy within a week of the investor revolt. Marcus faced multiple civil lawsuits seeking damages for fraud, theft, and harassment. Criminal charges were filed in federal court, including wire fraud, money laundering, and cyberstalking. His personal assets were frozen pending resolution of the various legal proceedings. More importantly for Sarah, the exposure of Marcus's deepfake capabilities completely discredited his fabricated recordings. Forensic analysis proved that the conversations had been manipulated using artificial intelligence, making them inadmissible as evidence and destroying any credibility Marcus might have retained. The man who had spent months systematically destroying Sarah's peace of mind was now facing the complete annihilation of his own life. The predator, who had relied on his victim's isolation and fear, was now exposed to public scrutiny and legal accountability. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus realized that James Wellington had orchestrated his downfall with surgical precision. The venture capitalist hadn't just defended Sarah, he had eliminated a threat to society while ensuring that Marcus could never hurt anyone again. James called Sarah on the morning that news of Marcus's arrest broke across every major business publication. She was sitting in her mother's kitchen, still struggling with the impossible choice Marcus had given her the previous day. "Sarah, turn on the news," James said without preamble. "Your problems with Marcus Blake are permanently solved." Sarah watched in amazement as reporters described the complete collapse of Techflow Dynamics and Marcus's arrest on federal fraud charges. The man who had terrorized her for months was now facing 20 years in federal prison, and his entire criminal enterprise had been exposed for the world to see. "How did you know?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. "I've been investigating him since the first suspicious articles appeared," James replied. "I knew someone was targeting you specifically, and I suspected it was your ex-husband. It just took time to gather enough evidence to destroy him completely." The relief was overwhelming. Sarah had spent months believing she was alone against Marcus's assault, but James had been protecting her the entire time. The man she loved hadn't just stood by her during the crisis, he had systematically dismantled the threat while allowing her to maintain her dignity and independence. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked. "Because you needed to know that you could survive his attacks without being rescued," James said gently. "You're not a victim anymore, Sarah. You're a survivor who happened to have backup." The distinction was crucial for Sarah's healing process. She hadn't been saved by James's intervention. She had endured Marcus's campaign while James ensured that justice would ultimately prevail. The strength had come from within her, not from external rescue. Marcus Blake's reign of terror was over, but the damage he had inflicted on Sarah's psyche would take time to heal. The man who had once seemed invincible was now facing the consequences of his actions, while the woman he had tried to destroy was finally free to build the future she deserved. The final victory belonged to Sarah, but it had come at a price that would reshape her understanding of power, justice, and the courage required to overcome systematic abuse. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was packed with media and spectators for Marcus Blake's sentencing hearing. 6 months after his arrest, Marcus had pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, corporate embezzlement, and cyberstalking. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that his attorneys had advised accepting a plea agreement rather than risking a longer sentence at trial. Sarah sat in the gallery with James, watching the man who had terrorized her for years face the consequences of his actions. Marcus looked diminished in his orange jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the arrogant entrepreneur who had celebrated his startup success at Gibson's Steakhouse. The federal detention center had stripped away his expensive suits and confident swagger, revealing the pathetic bully underneath. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chen detailed Marcus's crimes with clinical precision, describing how he had built his career on fraud while systematically destroying anyone who challenged his authority. The victim impact statements painted a picture of serial predation spanning multiple years and dozens of targets. "Mr. Blake represents a particularly dangerous type of criminal," Chen told Judge Patricia Morrison. "He used sophisticated technology and psychological manipulation to destroy lives while hiding behind a facade of legitimate business success. His victims include former employees, business rivals, and intimate partners who trusted him with their vulnerability. Sarah had submitted her own victim impact statement, but chose not to read it in court. The document described the psychological trauma of Marcus's harassment campaign and the ongoing effects of his manipulation on her ability to trust herself and others. But Sarah had decided that Marcus didn't deserve to hear her pain directly or witness its impact on her healing process. Marcus's defense attorney attempted to portray his client as a troubled man whose business failures had driven him to desperate measures. The argument fell flat given the evidence of Marcus's systematic predation spanning multiple years. This wasn't desperation, it was calculated cruelty disguised as entrepreneurial ambition. When given the opportunity to address the court, Marcus offered a carefully crafted apology that fooled no one. He expressed regret for his actions while minimizing their impact and suggesting that business pressures had clouded his judgment. The performance was hollow and self-serving, exactly what Sarah expected from someone incapable of genuine remorse. Judge Morrison was unimpressed by Marcus's statement. "Mr. Blake, you have systematically destroyed lives while portraying yourself as a victim of circumstances beyond your control. Your crimes were not mistakes or lapses in judgment. They were deliberate, calculated attacks on vulnerable people who trusted you." The sentence was harsh but appropriate. 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Marcus would also pay millions in restitution to his victims and forfeit all assets obtained through criminal activity. At 37 years old, he would spend the prime of his life in federal custody. As Marcus was led away in shackles, Sarah felt an unexpected emotion: pity. The man who had once seemed so powerful and threatening was now reduced to a defeated criminal facing decades of imprisonment. His empire had crumbled, his reputation was destroyed, and his future consisted of nothing but consequences for his past actions. "How do you feel?" James asked as they left the courthouse. "Empty," Sarah replied honestly. "I thought I would feel vindicated or relieved, but mostly I just feel tired." The criminal proceedings were over, but Sarah's healing process would continue for years. Marcus's systematic abuse had rewired her neural pathways, creating patterns of self-doubt and hypervigilance that couldn't be fixed by a single court ruling. Justice was important, but it wasn't a cure for trauma. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Sarah's therapist, helped her understand that recovery from psychological abuse was a gradual process rather than a destination. "Marcus Blake can't hurt you anymore," Dr. Vasquez explained during one of their sessions, "but the work of rebuilding your relationship with yourself is ongoing. Healing happens in layers, not in dramatic breakthroughs." Sarah's professional life flourished in Marcus's absence. Wellington Capital's ethical investment initiative became a model for responsible venture capitalism, generating both profits and positive social impact. Sarah's expertise in financial crimes prevention made her one of the most sought-after consultants in the technology industry. More importantly, Sarah began trusting her own judgment again. The voice of doubt that had echoed Marcus's manipulation grew quieter with each successful decision and every healthy relationship interaction. She was rebuilding not just her career, but her fundamental sense of self-worth. Her mother's condition continued to deteriorate, but Sarah approached the challenge with new confidence and support systems. James helped arrange the best possible care for Diane while ensuring that Sarah didn't carry the emotional burden alone. The crisis that Marcus had tried to weaponize became an opportunity for Sarah to practice self-compassion and accept help from people who loved her. "You're not responsible for fixing everything," James reminded Sarah when she struggled with guilt about her mother's declining health. "Sometimes love means accepting help and sharing burdens rather than carrying them alone." The lesson extended beyond caregiving to every aspect of Sarah's rebuilt life. She was learning to trust others without sacrificing her independence, to accept support without feeling obligated, and to love without losing herself in the process. A year after Marcus's sentencing, Sarah received an unexpected letter from federal prison. Marcus had written to apologize for his actions and request forgiveness for the pain he had caused. The letter was longer and more detailed than his courtroom statement, acknowledging specific instances of manipulation and expressing understanding of their lasting impact. Sarah read the letter once and then destroyed it without responding. Forgiveness was a gift that Marcus hadn't earned, and Sarah wasn't required to give. Her healing didn't depend on his redemption or her capacity for mercy. She was moving forward without him, and that was enough. The woman who had once prosecuted corporate criminals had survived becoming the victim of a different kind of predator. She had been broken down systematically, but had rebuilt herself stronger and wiser. The prosecutor who had feared trusting her own judgment was now making decisions that affected millions of dollars in investments and shaped the ethical standards of entire industries. Marcus Blake's attempt to destroy Sarah Collins had ultimately freed her from the last vestiges of self-doubt and people-pleasing that had made her vulnerable to manipulation. She was no longer the woman who needed external validation or feared making powerful enemies. She was simply Sarah, brilliant, resilient, and finally completely herself. 2 years after Marcus Blake's sentencing, Sarah Collins stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of Wellington Capital's new Chicago headquarters, watching the morning light reflect off Lake Michigan. The building itself was a testament to ethical business practices, featuring sustainable design elements and office space donated to nonprofit organizations working on social justice issues. Sarah's reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed. The haunted uncertainty that had shadowed her features during their harassment campaign was gone, replaced by quiet confidence and purposeful determination. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a silk blouse, professional attire that projected authority without sacrificing femininity. The executive team meeting she was about to lead would make decisions affecting hundreds of millions in investments across 36 technology companies. Sarah's expertise in financial crimes and ethical business practices had become Wellington Capital's secret weapon, allowing them to identify both promising opportunities and hidden risks that other venture capital firms missed. The Nexus Robotics due diligence report is fascinating, said David Park, Wellington Capital's newest partner, as he reviewed Sarah's analysis. Their technology could revolutionize manufacturing, but you've identified some concerning patterns in their financial reporting. Sarah nodded, pointing to specific anomalies in the robotics company's accounting practices. The revenue recognition is aggressive but legal. However, the pattern suggests they're prioritizing short-term metrics over sustainable growth. It's not fraudulent, but it indicates management priorities that could become problematic. The conversation exemplified how Sarah had transformed her prosecutorial instincts into investment advantages. Where other venture capitalists saw promising revenue growth, Sarah identified sustainability concerns. Where others focused on market potential, Sarah evaluated leadership character and ethical frameworks. James Wellington watched the discussion with obvious pride in his partner's capabilities. Their professional relationship had evolved into true collaboration, with Sarah's expertise complementing rather than subordinating to James's experience. More importantly, their personal relationship had deepened into the kind of partnership Sarah had never imagined possible. The difference between James and Marcus was stark in every interaction, but nowhere more clearly than in how they handled Sarah's professional success. Where Marcus had felt threatened by Sarah's expertise and tried to diminish her accomplishments, James celebrated her victories and amplified her influence within the venture capital community. Sarah's background gives us insight that purely financial analysis can't provide, James explained to potential investors during partnership meetings. She understands the human factors that determine whether companies succeed or fail. Character matters more than most people realize in business. The recognition felt validating after years of having her judgment questioned and her expertise dismissed. Sarah was building something meaningful, a new model for ethical investing that proved profitability and social responsibility could coexist successfully. Her personal life had found similar balance and purpose. The engagement ring on her left hand was a custom design featuring Sarah's birthstone surrounded by diamonds, created by a jewelry designer who specialized in ethical sourcing. James had proposed during a quiet weekend at his Lake Geneva estate, choosing intimacy over spectacle for their second engagement. "I want to spend my life building beautiful things with you," James had said as he offered the ring. "Companies that matter, investments that help people, a family that reflects our values." The proposal felt completely different from Marcus's calculated romance. James wasn't performing for an audience or trying to impress Sarah with his wealth. He was offering genuine partnership with someone whose judgment he respected and whose happiness he prioritized above his own comfort. Wedding planning had been collaborative rather than dictatorial, with James deferring to Sarah's preferences on everything from venue selection to guest lists. They chose a small ceremony at the Chicago Botanic Garden, focusing on intimacy and meaning rather than displaying wealth or social connections. Sarah's mother Diane had good days and difficult ones, but she remained lucid enough to understand that her daughter was marrying someone who truly loved her. During one of their evening visits, Diane offered advice that crystallized Sarah's growth. "The difference between James and that other man," Diane said with characteristic bluntness, "is that James makes you more yourself instead of less. That's how you know it's real love." The observation was profound in its simplicity. Marcus had systematically diminished Sarah's confidence and independence, while James consistently amplified her capabilities and supported her autonomy. The contrast revealed not just the difference between abusive and healthy relationships, but between partners who drain versus those who energize. Sarah's work with trauma survivors had become another source of meaning and purpose. She volunteered with organizations supporting women leaving abusive relationships, using her legal expertise to help them navigate divorce proceedings and protective orders. Her own experience with psychological manipulation made her particularly effective at recognizing and countering gaslighting tactics. "You survived something that destroys most people," she told a young woman whose tech executive husband had systematically isolated her from friends and family. "That survival instinct is your superpower now. Trust it." The volunteer work was emotionally challenging, but deeply fulfilling. Sarah was transforming her traumatic experience into wisdom that could protect other women from similar abuse. Marcus's attempt to destroy her had ultimately equipped her to help others rebuild their lives. 6 months after the wedding, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, triggering memories of Marcus's threats about children and family obligations. Dr. Vasquez helped Sarah distinguish between legitimate concerns about parenting and trauma responses from her abusive marriage. "Marcus used the idea of children as a weapon against you," the therapist explained, "but children with James would be something completely different. You get to choose what kind of mother you want to be, free from anyone else's expectations or manipulations." James's response to the pregnancy news was characteristically supportive and thoughtful. He immediately began researching childcare policies for Wellington Capital employees and discussing how to structure Sarah's responsibilities to accommodate parenting demands. His first concern was ensuring Sarah's health and happiness, rather than protecting his business interests. "We'll figure out the logistics together," James said as they discussed how pregnancy would affect Sarah's travel schedule. "The company can adapt to our family needs, not the other way around." The promise represented everything Sarah had learned about healthy partnerships: mutual support, shared decision-making, and prioritizing relationship health over external pressures. As Sarah prepared for motherhood while continuing to build Wellington Capital's ethical investment practice, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Marcus Blake's systematic abuse had nearly destroyed her, but surviving it had revealed reserves of strength and wisdom she never knew she possessed. The woman who once feared trusting her own judgment was now making decisions that affected billions of dollars in investments. The prosecutor who had been silenced by character assassination was now using her voice to protect other abuse survivors. The wife who had been diminished and controlled was now building an equal partnership with someone who celebrated her independence. Marcus Blake remained in federal prison, serving his 15-year sentence, while Sarah built the life he had tried to prevent her from having. She rarely thought about him anymore, except as a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing manipulation before it could take root. The ultimate victory wasn't Marcus's imprisonment or the restoration of Sarah's reputation. It was simpler and more profound. Sarah Collins had learned to trust herself completely, love without losing her identity, and build something beautiful from the ruins of what others had destroyed. Standing in her office above Lake Michigan, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her growing belly, Sarah smiled at her reflection in the glass. She was exactly where she belonged: confident, purposeful, and finally completely free. The woman Marcus Blake had tried to destroy was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and unafraid of her own power. That transformation was worth everything she had endured to achieve it. And that's how a man who thought he held all the power learned that true strength comes from building others up, not tearing them down. Sarah Collins didn't just survive Marcus Blake's psychological warfare. She transformed it into wisdom that now protects countless others from similar predators. This story proves that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who tries to destroy you is simply refuse to stay broken. Sarah didn't just win, she became the person Marcus never had the character to be. But here's what I want to know. Have you ever had someone try to convince you that you were less capable than you really were? That voice of doubt that sounds like someone from your past? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story hit you in the feels, smash that like button. It genuinely helps more people find these stories when they need them most. And if you know someone who needs to hear that they can rebuild from anything, share this with them. Sometimes we all need a reminder that the people who try to make us smaller are usually revealing their own limitations, not ours. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because we've got more stories coming that prove resilience always wins in the end. Until next time, remember, the best revenge is building something beautiful from the pieces someone else tried to scatter.